Hi friends, have you ever needed to paint wood grain for one reason or another? Today's video I'm going to show you how to do it in watercolor. A while back I had done a video on how to paint a faux wood grain effect using acrylic, and you can apply that to any surface that accepts acrylic paint. And if you'd like to check out that video, you can click on this video right here to see more about that. But today we're doing it in watercolor. I think that it is fun to do and can be very useful for a variety of different applications. Maybe you need to paint a fence or a wood sign or a tabletop. Whatever your reasons, there are a lot of ways to do it, as wood grain is very varied. The way the wood grain looks and what color it is depends greatly on what type of wood you're looking at and if it's painted or stained. So for today's example, I'm just going to do 4 basic ones in brown colors, but whenever you do yours, you can certainly use any colors you might like depending on, again, what kind of paint or stain your imaginary surface has. I'll be showing you these directly from above, and of course if you want to put them in perspective, I'll help you out a little bit with that at the end. For these examples, I'll be using my Mijello palette, and I have a selection of colors in here that are actually a couple different brands, so if you want to learn more about that, check out the description. I'll be painting in my Arteza watercolor sketchbook. For brushes, you can pretty much use whatever you have that is for watercolor. Today I am using a Royal & Langnickel angled flat brush in a 1/2 inch size from the Zen line, and a Princeton Velvet Touch long round in a size 2. I don't want you to get too tripped up on the colors, so I'll just say that I use yellow, reds, and browns for this for the most part. Prep your palette by activating some of those colors and making a few shades of brown. On our first example, we are going to make some planks, and each plank we want to be a slightly different shade just for some variety. So I'm going to take my first shade of a reddish brown and lay it down in a horizontal fashion, and then I'm going to take that same color and add a little bit of yellow to it and do a plank right next to that. You can make this as light or as dark as you want, but do remember that watercolor does lighten as it dries. And I'm taking a slightly different hue and doing the same thing. So these planks are only slightly varied in color. I didn't want them to look like I chopped down 4 different trees. I just kind of wanted them to look like maybe they got stained or weathered at different rates. So they're kind of close in color, but just a little bit different, so you can see a difference between them. You can leave a little gap if your plank has some space, or have them right up against each other. For this, I'm doing a wet on wet technique, and I've taken my smaller brush at this point and some of those varying shades, and I'm just stroking in some thin lines with this thin brush, and there's a lot of bleeding because the base is still quite wet. So I'm going to go back and forth, wet into wet, to have some of these nice blending and bleeding of colors just for some variety. This paper actually soaks up the water quite fast, so the effect that you get when you're laying down your color will depend greatly on whether or not that base layer is dry. I'm taking a sharp object now to kind of scrape away some of that paint. It didn't work that well on this paper. Typically thick, nice paper you can get a good scrape on, but for me it didn't quite work in this notebook. It's not the highest of quality, but it's good enough for this. I've made a little bit of a darker color using some indigo, some sap green, and some brown to make a kind of muted dark shade. And I'm focusing a lot on the edges because I like the way it looks to have wood planks with really weathered, darkened ends. And I'm keeping those brush strokes relatively horizontal because that's the direction of my wood grain. You can add as many layers as you like. I'm trying to get a lot of different shades in right now while it's still mostly wet. You can let it dry and continue to do the same, adding in knots or defining the edges of your planks individually as you like it. I'm going to speed through this so you can kind of see just what the finished product will look like. This would make a nice base for a wood sign or a dilapidated door. I'm sure you can find many uses for it. Alright, so there is the first example. A nice weathered wooden plank. For our second example, we're going to need to start with a even wash of a light color. It doesn't have to be that light, but just think of it as whatever shade this piece of wood is going to be. You want the lightest for the base, and then we'll add all the grainy details in a darker shade later. So make sure you mix up enough of your base color, and we're just going to get a nice flat wash of even color down. Now that it's dry, we're going to need to go in and define some of that wood grain. We're going to take some of a similar color. You can make it slightly darker or more concentrated to have it really pop out against that base color. On this, I'm using the small brush and a light touch to give some horizontal lines because that is the flow of my wood grain. And I've started off with kind of a eye or a knot in that wood. When wood has knots, you get the wood grain around it kind of pushing and bending, so you can see that the lines next to it follow the same curve. And I'm playing with the line weight a little bit just by varying my pressure, so I have thick and thin lines, make it interesting. Not all the lines connect, but it's generally going in the same direction. We don't really want it too straight. You can even see the wood of the desk right underneath it and how that is kind of curved. Some lines are closer, there's some shading. You can really play with it and go as simple or as detailed as you like. So I think you get the idea of that. I'll go ahead and speed through the rest of this one and we'll take a look at it finished. Wood grain number 3. For this, we are going to again start with a flat wash of color. So whatever shade you like, go ahead and get that laid down and a nice even wash. And we'll let it dry. Now we're going to take a darker shade of brown and that small brush again, and the same kind of grain setup as the last one. We're basically going to be doing vertically on this one, and we're going to do short strokes following the direction of the grain. Instead of the smooth continuous lines, each line is kind of broken up into short little strokes. We just want to make sure all these little strokes are relatively parallel to each other. It's still following the same general patterns that we did in the last example. This does take a little bit longer, so I'm going to speed through it. And there's wood grain number 4. On our last example, we are going to lay down a base again using the flat brush and very, very little paint on the tip of that brush. We're going to go for a dry brushing effect. So for this to work, you'll actually need a paper that has a grainy texture. A cold press watercolor paper is ideal for this. A hot press watercolor will be much too smooth and a lot harder to get any kind of texture. With the dry brush, you can get a lot of the white still exposed, and whatever direction you are brushing in will be the direction of your wood grain. Once that's laid down, we can take our smaller brush and a darker shade again, and we're going to do the exact same thing that we did in the last two. Our wood grain is going to be a combination of those last two techniques. So we're going to go horizontal with the dry brush. And using this small brush, I'm going to mimic the same kind of pattern with short strokes, but this time those little strokes are connected. So it's rough and kind of somewhere in between the last two examples. And we'll just speed through this a little bit so you can see how it comes along. It's also nice to vary the shade of your color sometimes. Like for this one, I dropped in some darker colors into wet spots just to have some variety of color. You can do that as you go through it the first time, or like I'm doing, drop it in after the fact. As long as it's still wet, it'll bleed nicely. So there you have it, guys. There are 4 ways to paint wood grain from directly above, and as promised, I just wanted to go over how you might put these in perspective. So let's say this is a tabletop and the blue circle is a glass of water sitting on the table. This would be as viewed from above, which we can only use in so many situations. So if we were to do a more natural perspective, say the table in front of us, it would look more like this. The grain pattern furthest from you is going to be a lot closer together and a lot thinner, and the closer you are to the wood grain, the more obvious it is to see and the more spread out those lines will be. This video is not really about perspective, but I did want to point that out as it does affect the actual wood grain, so I hope you found that little tidbit useful. Thanks for watching, and as always, all the links to the items I'm using or items very similar are down in the description so that you can check them out there. Take care, guys, and happy creating!